Okay, let's get going. Good morning, everybody. This is Richard Chaplin here, and we are in episode 68 of Retuning Your Firm. I don't think there's any magic significance to the number 68, but who knows? What are we going to be talking about today? Well, we've got three themes. We always try and aim for three themes if we can. We're going to talk about brand with Keith, who's been thinking about brands for 30 plus years. We're looking at mergers, and everybody kind of thinks about mergers, maybe from the point of view of maybe people, venture capitalists coming in or whatever. But actually, most mergers, to be perfectly honest, are between firms, and one of whom is going to be the acquirer, one of whom is obviously the target. And we're going to be really interested to hear from David about what's going through the mind of acquirers. So what are the people who are acquisitive? What are they looking for? And then leadership, which is a kind of theme that we come to very, very often, but it's a really interesting theme, which I am eager to hear exactly what Keith has to say about that, because in a way, a brand without leadership doesn't really work very well, I suspect we'll find as we go forward. So let's talk on. So firstly, so myself, and how nice it is to be with you today. Let's go and talk about who's on the theme. So who's on today's panel? Well, the first person I would like to introduce you to is Keith Wells. Keith is the founder director of Brandwell, and he's been going to talk to us today about how can you achieve a market positioning that actually does some really important things. It inspires your people, it inspires your recruits, and it inspires your clients. And what are the things that really, really matter? And he's done a lot of validation. We'll hear a little bit more about that. What are the leadership attributes that really get you to that great place? Our second guest is David Sparks. Now, David is the CEO of Millbourn Ross, and he spends his day as an M&A broker actually helping primarily sector firms looking for growth through actually acquiring another firm. And that's a bit like if you're trying to sell a house, this is the agent that you don't get to sell the house for you, but you get to go and look for other houses for you. Slightly different role, obviously, for all sorts of reasons. Our third panel member today is Jeremy Beard. And Jeremy is the managing partner of Hayes Macintyre. For those of you who have been on the show before, I know we always have lots of regulars. I think we've all had Jeremy's fantastic insights. And the great thing I always think about Jeremy is that there's no bullshit. He'll just tell you as he sees it and how it relates to him and to his firm. And hopefully we'll have another set of fantastic insights today. And it's lovely to have somebody who genuinely has to cope with that intro every day of his life too. And lastly, and hopefully by no means least, yours truly, Richard Chaplin, and I'm the founder and chief executive of the Managing Partners Forum. So that's your panel for today. Before we get on with the poll section, I just really wanted to kind of talk a little bit about some of the forum news at the moment. As you probably know, we don't just run the show. We have with you, as if you like, as a studio audience. We also have hundreds of people watching the video from past shows. So please don't miss out. The second area I just wanted to cover was the Mentor Match program. Now, I think all of you probably would have had an email from me about it. It's in collaboration with the PM Forum. And what's it all about? Well, it's about identifying and bringing together mentors and mentees, and then providing a secure, confidential place for both parties to engage in and track all aspects of the mentoring relationship. And we've been quite sort of overwhelmed by the response. We have over 130 mentors now, nearly 100 mentees. And people are enrolling as far away literally as New Zealand. And we already have one mentorship in progress. So we already have actually two people have decided to actually entering into a mentoring agreement already, which is great. Now, it's a continuous program, so it's never too late. We're not blowing a whistle and then doing nothing for 6 months. It's running every day. So never too late to sign up either as a mentor or a mentee, or possibly both, because as we all know, reverse mentoring is something that has been very popular of late, particularly around a number of tech issues. What's the next news story? Well, we've got an invitation-only innovation summit. We're pretty sure that's going to be on the 18th of May in the afternoon in London, and an in-person event, which is awesome. And we're going to be launching the Fast Track Innovation Guide in partnership with Oxford Brookes Business School. So that's something, again, invitation only. And we're looking really for managing partners and directors of innovation. Those are the kind of people that we have in mind for that event. And the awards, I've been talking about them obviously during February. Their submissions close on Monday. That's the last day of February. But, if you're thinking about it and you're struggling to meet a deadline, you can always drop me an email and I might be able to help you. But we're definitely coming in quite fast at the moment from not just the UK. And what was interesting this year is we actually went away and we looked at who are the top 20 firms over the 20 years. And that league table was published during the week. So why don't you check out if your firm's on it? It's obviously on the social media. And we're looking hopefully for a number of those 20th anniversary for awards for, let's see, firms from the top 20. I know a number of them are definitely entering, which is awesome. So that's fantastic. So let's move on. As you probably know, feedback from the UK government on our polls is always helpful. And this particular quote we really love: your poll results are incredibly valuable in our analysis during these dynamic times. So what happened in the last poll? You may remember we were looking in the whole area of new technologies. And what we observed was that people were expecting a shift from what you might call, we rely on the knowledge and abilities of our human experts at one end of the spectrum, to content being delivered through proprietary online systems at the other. And I'm not suggesting anybody who's saying that they're really in the latter space. That is a fairly specialist area, but there's definitely perceived to be a shift between the two. And I'll show you a chart about that in a minute. Where have the most expensive changes been observed? Well, that's really been in the technologies which are used to deliver and produce services, and then linked to that, the way the services are then delivered. So it's the real changes have been around production and delivery of services using the tech. That's been the key change over the last, I think, 3 years, if I recall. What's driving it? What's important? Well, existing clients, the main driver, efficiency, and then taking advantage of some of the technological possibilities. What's getting in the way? Again, it's probably the usual suspects: lack of time. Well, that's sort of another way of saying lower priority, because we can actually control our time, how we spend it. Money, again, I think there's some concerns that a lot of money may have been spent in areas that perhaps didn't then generate the returns that were hoped for. And the whole area of integration and incorporation of technology into an existing stack, which is something that if you've ever spoken to an IT person about, is a headache. And it's true for a bank with their legacy systems, as I understand it too. Where's the most investment going? Well, and again, this probably won't surprise you. It was the headline in the news story on the website. Most investment is in the tools that substitute or enhance routine tasks. Routine being, if you like, things that you're already doing, speeding things up and reducing costs. What's missing? Well, anything to do with new and other things that we weren't doing before that we can now do. AI doesn't really get much of a mention either. So the real message is, yeah, we're using the new technologies, but we're really just using them to make things work that we're already doing work more effectively, and enhance them in various ways. So that was the feedback. I'll just show you 2 or 3 quick slides. So what's the first one? Well, if you've got a small screen, I'll talk you through it quickly. The current situation is in red, and the blue is where people anticipate they're going to be in 3 years' time. And at the top, it's our business model depends primarily on the knowledge and abilities of our human experts. And at the bottom, it's our business model depends primarily on delivering content through proprietary online systems. And as you can see, there's a gentle work moving down the chart, and it's not dramatic in some ways, but that's sort of what you're seeing there. Again, this one's quite busy, so I'll talk you through it really quickly. The most extensive changes, it says, are in technology used to deliver and produce services. And the same arrangement, in other words, red shows what's been happening for the past 3 years. And blue says where people expect it to be in the next 3 years. And the one at the top is called the technologies you use to deliver services. That's at 75% in 3 years, 62% over the past 3. The technologies you use to produce services comes in at second, and how you deliver your services to customers and clients. Now, the one that is much lower is how you develop strategies, your main clients or customers, the types of people used to provide services, how you select those in leadership roles. So the changes are all around technology. I think that's something, again, people would. And here's the last chart. This is looking really at where's the investment in tools that substitute, enhance routine tasks. And that's the top one. And again, past 3 years in red, next 3 years in blue. So you can see that at the top one, the substitution of routinely performed tasks previously undertaken by people grows from 54 to 69%. The augmentation enhancement of tasks previously undertaken by people, again, that's up into the 60s. Reducing costs is in the next 3 years is seen to be a major jumps from 23 to 54. But the introduction of new tasks or services that we're not previously able to provide is about 20%. It's just not seen as anything like as high priority. So that's the feedback that I wanted to give you on the poll that you kindly completed a couple of weeks ago. And today we've got a poll which is looking at leadership attributes. Now, what are we talking about here? Well, the things we're talking about here is the extent that firms are measuring and doing things differently compared to 2 or 3 years ago. Is anybody noticing? And are you actually checking with other sectors or for good ideas? Or is it all same for same, only looking at your narrow competitors? Are you in tune with big picture issues? Do you show empathy? Are you more comfortable being a leader than a follower? Do you want people to take personal responsibility for their actions? And do you run the sort of firm where people think beyond their own priorities and are encouraged to give time to others? Now, if you're, and I know there are a few consultants who are listening in, if you substitute a firm that you know well as a consultant for your firm, and I've put that in the questions, then I think you'll be able to answer all of them. It's actually quite a simple survey, this one. Thank you for Keith for providing the questions. It requires a great researcher to be able to ask simple questions, I always think. And they're all single choice. So again, I don't think you're going to take very long. I will allow you 3 minutes. I actually think you're going to need less time than that. So where do we start? I'll just run through the answers quickly, and then Keith, who actually set the questions, I'm sure will come with his own more considered and professional insights. So about half of you saying that firms are doing things differently, but not measuring differently. That comes through quite strongly. Somewhat modest in the neither nor. Most people are either split between measuring and doing differently, or measuring differently but not doing differently. So that's the first one. In terms of the second question, that was, if you recall, the sector as a whole. When it then comes to their own firm, of course, they are doing measuring and doing things differently. So in other words, what we as a firm are doing is ahead of the sector as a whole. Now that again isn't wholly surprising. I think a lot of people consider that they are in the vanguard. But what was, if you recall, about 20% saying measuring and doing differently, has now doubled to 40%. And the people who are doing differently but not measuring has dropped down to 30. So again, a little bit of movement there. In terms of have clients noticed? Yeah, 60% say yep. 20% aren't sure. 20% say no, which is fair enough. Are they measuring against other sectors? Very seriously, 80% no. And this is not because there's nothing to learn from other sectors. That option wasn't ticked. 20% say they are, but 80% no, they're not. And if you recall, it was the client observed that professional firms comparing themselves with each other is simply the bad comparing with the bad. Do you believe that professional firms look sufficiently to other sectors for ideas and insight? And I think Keith will have lots of thoughts on that one. So we're now going through some of the sort of specific attributes that we indicated. And the first one was really looking at being in tune with the big pictures. And what comes through, I think, fairly strongly here, and it's essentially an awareness question, as I'm sure you will have identified, is 50% of you roughly are at 8, and about the same percentage are at 6. So it's kind of split between 6 and 8. If I move on to a courage question, about the one that jumps out loudest is 7 out of 10. Nobody's at maximum. A small percentage at 9, but at 6 and 7 is the kind of the core area there. In terms of another, this is more of a generosity question. We got a little bit more up into the 9s on this one. 30% in the 9s, about 40% in the 7s, and then falling away. Somebody actually down to 3s. That's kind of low, I think. Never mind. Culture around awareness and to the extent to which there is emotional intelligence and people show empathy in their dealings with others. Yeah, some at maximum. 8's probably the biggest. 7 to 8 is probably the main area for that one. Moving on now to another courage question, which is about people taking personal responsibility for their actions, and as a firm believing that accountability both to themselves, your clients, and to your communities. And again, a few at the maximum. 9 is the one that comes through strongest on that one. And the final question is about people, this is generosity people are encouraged to give others and colleagues and all clients time and not to think on the clock. And again, a little bit right at the top, but 8 is the one that comes through strongest there. So I think I'll probably stop sharing now, if I may. And I will now invite our first guest, which is Keith, to come and share his thoughts. Over to you, sir.
Thanks, Richard. Really good to be part of the show. I think I've watched 40 something of the 68 you've done, so it's good to be this side of the camera front. And thanks to everyone for completing those questions. I'll come back to some observations of those, but first I'll give you some context for them. I think if we were to look at the headlines surrounding professional services generally over the past few months, quite a schizophrenic picture might emerge. On one hand, you've got firms and individuals doing fantastically well financially, but clearly struggling in lots of other areas. Whether the advent of a chief happiness officer is going to change that, I don't know. The senior partner of a top 20 law firm we spoke to about 15 months ago actually used quite a disturbing phrase. He said, there's a lot of intellectual dishonesty in this sector. And what he meant by that was that for all the good words, as he said, about culture and well-being and purpose and so on, really what drives professionals today is what's always driven them and always will do, and that's money. People are just interested and motivated by money. Well, maybe, but I think genuinely there is a recognition that the world is different. I think the ways people are deciding who to buy from and who to work for are changing, and there are quite powerful trends driving those changes. But it's interesting, we've just seen in that poll, we're doing things differently, but not measuring. There is a phrase which comes to mind of what gets measured gets done. And I think for leaders to have to know how to attract the right talent and have the right clients, they need the right insights. And that starts with asking the right questions. And I was working with a professional firm 3 or 4 years ago now on the idea of defining leadership. And we couldn't find a model that really identified what those powerful emerging trends are, or allowed them to evaluate their own and their, as a firm and as individuals, performance on them. So did we know how well we're doing all the things we need to be great at? Wasn't really available. So we created one, worked with a research company to turn it into something that could be quantified. And since then it's been validated through 3 waves of research across 4 markets, 30,000 consumer responses evaluating about 100 of the world's biggest business brands, and we've got 210,000 data points and knee deep in data. So we know as a piece of research it works. And what we did was to take the trends and identify them. We've got them down to 6 dimensions, which if I run through now, and you'll see some of the background to the questions we've just looked at. The first one is what we called awareness. And that is a sense of, is this a business that is in tune with the big picture, understands how needs are changing, can anticipate that, can put themselves in another's position. Out of that, the second one is then purpose. So if we know what the big picture is, can we articulate our role and our contribution to that? Is it visible in everything that we do? Third one is courage. Are we really prepared to be a leader, not to be a follower? Will we take the risk of perhaps being wrong? And that's difficult in a professional services environment, I think, naturally. Then courage, generosity, a really interesting one and challenging one. Do people give of themselves? Are they motivated by more than self-interest? Do they recognize and encourage others' success? Then integrity. Will they do the right thing even when no one's watching? Can they be trusted to do the right thing by people? And finally, delivery. Will they keep their promises, never let people down, no matter what the circumstances are? So those are the 6 that we tested through those research studies I mentioned. Made it more specific now to leadership issues within the professional services sector. I've done that with a collaborator who may well be on this call, who's known to several people in this forum, a chap called Gordon Brown. And Gordon and I go back way back when, and he has conducted, I would guess, around 800 to 900 interviews with clients of professional services firms. I can chip in a couple of hundred to that. And in the recent conversations we've had, both with clients and with leaders of the firms around these 6 ideas that we've had, this what we call Leadership 6, it's been interesting that from the client's perspective, actually, they would still be saying, even towards the end of last year, that most of what we're seeing as being called, my abbreviation, client listening programs still tend to be rather backward looking, still tend to be more focused on the operational delivery issues. One guy said the last 10 years issues, but sometimes given different names. Now, pre-pandemic, Gordon and I were having these conversations with GCs, clients, and with leaders in the firms. And it was obvious then that the leadership teams were already wrestling with these issues. Interesting, there's a PwC report in, I think, May or June of 2020 that said the need to transition to a new world was already clear long before COVID. It's just made everything much quicker. One managing partner of a law firm we spoke to said, we've been talking about these ideas for a long time. I wish we'd had this framework to work with. Now, sort of, I don't want to say post-pandemic, but now, two themes are coming through even more strongly. One relates to the question we've just asked, the value of having what one person calls this outside-in perspective. And that thought was, if we're committing more to ideas like culture and values and purpose and differentiation and brand in its proper sense, it would be instructive to look at organizations that have been doing this well for a lot longer. So the comment there from a GC about law firms comparing with each other as bad comparing with bad. There was another one where a managing partner said he'd love the chance to stand up at a partners retreat and say, we are the Apple of our sector. So the other thing that's coming through is that of those 6 dimensions, 3 are really seen as key to a proper sustainable recovery from what we've been through. And those 3 are awareness, generosity, and courage. And we think in the discussions we've had will say they're all hard challenges for leaders anyway, but especially more so in organizations which are paid to be right. And it's less straightforward for people to get into these sorts of conversations. Awareness really picks up, I think, what's coming through strongly is the importance of emotional intelligence as a quality that underpins the interpersonal relationships with colleagues and clients. And I think that really starts with self-awareness, and conversations I've had recently with 3 or 4 executive coaches have said that this is really probably the number 1 on the list with clients they're working with. Second one is generosity. That's the dimension that's grabbed most people's attention. How do we demonstrate generosity? And how do we make people feel that they're in an environment in which that is recognized? And I think that goes and really does challenge that view we had before of the intellectual dishonesty in the sector. Incidentally, I don't think any business can talk of having a purpose if it doesn't have awareness or generosity. So that's probably for another conversation. And the third one, then, courage. And I think that's really about the spirit and commitment to being a leader rather than a follower. And it demands a different view of, different relationship with risk, which again, in organizations who are normally paid or expected to be right, that's difficult, and that takes a lot of sensitivity. So bring it all together, I think, as firms try to set a sustainable path towards that longer term recovery. Yes, it is easy to be cynical. Yes, it is easy to talk about revenue figures and PEP and everything else, but we believe that there are firms and leaders within them who really do want to make their businesses better and are willing to take up the other part of that PwC report statement, which was that it would be unfortunate, indeed catastrophic, not to take advantage of the opportunity that now presents itself to us.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. And our second guest is David Sparks. Now, David is the CEO of Millbourn Ross, and he's talking to us today about what sector firms who are looking for growth through merger and acquisition, what are they looking for in a target?
I'm going to ask you to cast your mind back to 1910. That's easier for some than others, I appreciate. A New York accountant called James Marwick is crossing the Atlantic to visit his newly opened Paris office. During the crossing, he encounters William Barclay Peat, and over the 6-day voyage, the 2 men find they have much in common. Not only did both men run accounting firms, but more importantly, they had a shared perspective on professional values. On the 8th of October 1910, Peat and Marwick agreed to merge aboard that ship. That ship was called the Lusitania, and that firm, if you roll forward 110 years, still stands today as KPMG. And Richard, I expect you might be familiar with that story, as I know your early career was spent with Peat Marwick, albeit I'm not suggesting quite as early as 1910. But for me, the point of that story is that serendipity is not a strategy. And whilst, as we can see, serendipitous meetings can have a positive outcome, If growth through M&A is a part of your growth strategy, it's essential to invest in the planning, the research, and origination process. So for the purposes of this presentation, I'll briefly explore two areas: the drivers of firms who've developed a strategy for growth, and then what those firms are looking for from those targets. The reality is that the drivers have, and I think will remain the same for a very long time. So depending on the size and the profile of your firm, it may well be that the pandemic has perhaps exacerbated some of the drivers that we're familiar with, such as increases in professional indemnity insurance or challenges around poor performing practice groups, and maybe a reliance on underperforming sector or particular clients, and even increasing regulatory and compliance burdens that so many firms face. But other familiar drivers include things like succession planning and differentiation, which I'd like to come back to. In terms of priorities for growth, we generally distill these down into four areas: so geography, sectors, practice areas, and expertise, and then reflect on those as opportunities for growth through whether that's entering new markets, growing existing markets, consolidating existing markets, or reinforcing those markets. And ultimately, the firm's drivers will be influenced by its owners and a combination of their personal circumstances and their ambition, the ambition perhaps of the wider ownership or leadership group. So coming back to the point about differentiation, the challenge is how do owners go about differentiating their firm and future-proofing their business in what is an increasingly competitive landscape. So many firms are acutely aware of the changing shape and complexity of our market in which they operate. And in order to sustain that future, they're really considering opportunities to scale through M&A, and whether that's growing a business through acquisition or potentially merging up into a larger firm. To my mind, there needs to be a really clear reason for a merger. For example, merging two 20 million revenue firms does increase scale, potentially footprint. It doesn't necessarily increase service lines or the ability to serve more complex clients, but what you now have is a 40 million pound firm competing against the same firms for the same clients, with perhaps a slightly better margin if costs have been taken out. So as for what a firm's looking for in targets, if the focus is growth and stability, the outcome of any of these routes must be to obtain mutual leverage across practice areas in order to retain existing clients and serve new ones, financial security, a broader market offering, and an increased client base. And there are undoubtedly similar strategies being played out across the UK and further afield. So in the last few months, we've seen Waitman's merge with Radcliffe's Labrassa, Royd's Willie King merge with Goodman Derrick, DMH Stallard merge with Griffith Smith, and Knights PLC have acquired Langley's. And all of these transactions, to my mind, have geographical implications, whether that's reinforcing an existing presence or perhaps opening a new door and new opportunities. So in terms of what firms are looking for, profitable growth unfailingly underpins every M&A strategy. Profitable firms who are robustly governed in relation to finance and compliance, and who would consider being acquired, which I think is a really important point, are really highly sought after at the minute. And finally, as the saying goes, culture eats strategy for breakfast. So start with finding someone you like. Thanks, Richard.
Yeah, I think you're right. I wasn't around in 1910, but hey, that's another story. Where are we at? Just to say that I really now would like to welcome Jeremy Beard. And Jeremy, as you know, is the managing partner of Hayes Macintyre, which is a mid-sized accountancy firm. And he will have obviously heard and seen the poll, heard what Keith had to say around leadership traits and leadership attributes and the various dimensions that were mentioned. And then also, and I have no idea if Hayes Macintyre is acquisitive or not relevant to today, but whether some of those attributes that David was talking about are ones that just any well-managed firm should be looking to have anyway. So over to you, Jeremy. Look forward to your thoughts.
Thank you, Richard, and good morning, everyone. And thank you to David and Keith. Very, very insightful. Perhaps if I just deal with David's first. I think certainly from a Hayes Macintyre perspective, acquisitions aren't part of our strategy at the moment, but but certainly we wouldn't dismiss that in the fullness of time. We do want to grow, and we think the market at the moment, there is good organic growth that we can achieve. We are starting to recognize, and perhaps this is where I sort of say, there might be something in the future. We are starting to act for larger clients and play in a bigger market, and therefore the need for us to invest in our infrastructure, whether that's around regulation and compliance, technical support, etc., it is rising all the time. And therefore, you do, as you build that infrastructure and incur that cost, we are going to have to grow significantly to cope with that. So, as I say, at the moment, there's good organic growth. We think we can achieve it without acquisition, but there might come a time where we say, look, we're playing in a market now where we need a much bigger and better infrastructure, and therefore we need to go on the acquisition trail. So that's my thoughts on that, certainly from our perspective. That's not to say we haven't done things in the past, and we have done. The Hayes Macintyre was a merger of Hayes Allen and Macintyre and Co. back in 2001, I think. And they were two very similar firms, and similar sized. So that brought its own challenges, but certainly it was a very successful merger, and achieved everything that we wanted to achieve at the time, albeit through some pain for a period. But certainly it was beneficial and acted as a very good springboard for us to grow and develop from there. Coming back to some of Keith's points, very interesting. And I was interested in his comment from the senior partner who said at the end of the day it comes back to money. we have these discussions, and we have, we talk certainly internally with our people about key priorities, and we have to be very careful about not labeling anything as the number one priority, because that can be dangerous, and people will be aware that through the audit profession there is certainly a big drive about quality at the moment, and the regulators and audit quality. And is that our number one priority, or is people and the well-being and health of our people the number one priority, or is profit the number one priority? And at the end of the day, nothing can be, in my view, the number one priority, but you can have a number of key priorities, and that's certainly what we've talked about, because inevitably with all of those things there has to be a balance, but it's getting that balance right. I certainly think we are in a transition period with regard to expectations around things like purpose versus profit, and certainly we are very conscious of our younger colleagues, and we have, I think, something like 30% of our workforce within, no more than that, probably close to 50% of our workforce within 3 years of leaving university. So certainly there is a greater expectation and recognition, and we have to be very conscious as a business of this, around business purpose, around diversity and inclusion. And recently we've had some really good feedback from new graduates who've joined us, who were very impressed with our approach to environmental and sustainability and that sort of thing. And that's, I'm not saying that because I'm pleased that we've been doing a lot in that area and it's been recognized. I'm saying that because actually they are looking for it. It demonstrates that they are looking for that sort of thing. And so I think it is vital that we continue to be very aware of that. In terms of being leaders, I think it's very difficult for a firm of our size to be a leader in in the external world of our profession. So in many ways, we have to be a follower. We can't be a leader in new audit technology, for example, because we simply don't have the amount of money to deal with that. So difficult for a firm of our size to be a leader as far as the profession is concerned. Of course, what we hope we are is leaders in the sectors in which we operate with our particular clients. And the important aspect of being leaders of people within our business. At the end of the day, we're a people business, so we have to demonstrate that we're leaders there. Should I pause, Richard? And
yeah, no, that's really helpful, Jeremy. I was just going to actually perhaps bring Keith into the conversation now, and just kind of, because we obviously you kindly set those questions a little bit earlier, and you had a chance to look at some of the feedback that came back. And to what extent do you think those answers were sort of in a good zone as opposed to a less good zone? And then perhaps picking up also the point that Jeremy was making around it's not necessarily a good idea to have a single focus area of focus, because at the end of the day, money may just jump to the top of the tree. How do you actually, in your mind, when you've got all six, is it important that all six are there, or can two or three take a more leading role? You indicated, I think, awareness and courage and generosity were perhaps more important than delivery and purpose. And I can't remember the last one, sorry, but anyway. So do you want to just give a little bit of,
yeah.
Thank you, sir. Do you want to just kind of give a little bit of thought on that? That'd be great. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, and Jeremy, take your point. I think there isn't an overriding priority. I think I wouldn't have the job of a managing partner or chief executive of a professional services firm if you paid me everything that I'm reading people get paid. I think it's always been really difficult, and it must be especially difficult at the moment. So hats off, chapeau, as they say. I think the poll answers, if I'm blunt, surprise me. I think I suspect a large element of overclaim in that. It's a little bit unfair because we're taking a very superficial snapshot, and we're doing, if I was to compare against the 30,000 responses we've had on the likes of Apple and Microsoft and IBM, we get different answers. But just interestingly, if I just do a top line comparison, in terms of awareness, I'm averaging averages here, it's not perfect, but Amazon came out top of our poll across the world, and its score, again, from external perspectives, was 8.3. And that's a 10-point scale. I'm averaging averages, it's not going to be exact, but to say, so do we think that we can stand comparison with? If we do, fantastic. I'm back to that managing partner saying, I'm standing up my partner's retreat saying, we are the Amazon, not the Apple, we are the Amazon of our sector, would be quite enlightening, I think. Apple, incidentally, was 7.26, which is quite interesting. I think generosity, not surprisingly, I think, was, apart from when we looked at charities, was the lowest ranking by some distance of all the business brands we looked at. Was always the one on which people said, nah. At the end of the day, they're out to make money. They're on their side, not ours. So we would be looking at, if Amazon came top on awareness 8.3, it came middle ranked at 5.85, which is generosity. So this is why I think there might be an element of overclaim on our poll this morning, but I don't want to be snide about that. The interesting one about courage, if Gordon's on the call, he's going to hate me saying this because he tells me not to. The one that came top out of all the poll that we've done across 30,000 people was Lego. And that always surprises me. But I think when I looked at it, I think in terms of being courageous, innovative, in a spirit of innovation of spirit, if I can put it that way, Lego, plastic building bricks, the product hasn't changed in decades and decades. But look what they've done with it, and look what they've brought it into. And think of all the disruption that's been in their sector of child entertainment and child education, and they've ridden that wave. And I think that's a brilliant lesson to anyone who thinks that they're in a commodity market. You're not. there's always value to be created. And I think innovation is much more about a mentality and the spirit, which I think is a great example. So I should stop really, because I'm looking at the time, unless you want me to address anything in particular.
No, that's fine. It's really helpful, and thank you very much. And it was, again, I think I always like to think that the people who watch the show are pioneers and thought leaders, and therefore not average. And the great thing about there's an interesting business model, which is called Crossing the Chasm, which basically says the early adopters are all busy in their sandpits having fun, but sort of setting the way. Then you have the early majority who kind of are keeping an eye out and doing pilots. And only when the early majority have ironed out the bugs do the vast majority then engage. And professional firms are, let's say, conservative by nature. So typically 80% of professional firms will be sitting in that final camp. So today, I suspect we're all a group of pioneers, but hey, that's not a good place to be. So David, to what extent does pioneering capability come up in the list of things that are important to a company focusing on growth through acquisition?
Thanks, Richard. I noted with interest actually all the points that Keith has talked about, from awareness, purpose, courage, generosity, integrity, and delivery. And I think a lot of those can really relate to how firms approach the firms that they are looking to acquire. As I mentioned, finally, really it's a culture piece. We quite often in conversations, the highest level denominators are really financial. So whether that's how much Pepper firm makes, or ultimately it's profitability, or perhaps the size of that firm in terms of it as a target. But the reality is that when we get into conversations, they have to start with a cultural start. You have to like the person that you're sitting in front of. And I think all the points that Keith has mentioned, actually, for myself, I should be taking away as really valuable contribution from today for conversations that I would encourage people to identify with. Keith also mentioned actually at the very start, people who buy from, or the behaviours of people who buy or want to work with people are changing. And I think that is a really, really important message, even in terms of M&A.
Right. Thanks. And perhaps coming back to Jeremy, if I may, I think the word culture has come through quite strongly. I mean, how would you describe your firm's culture to a new recruit?
Good question. I think we are certainly a progressive firm. We are just implementing a new strategy, which is putting people front and center of our strategy. So we're very conscious of supporting our people. Sorry, have you got some background noise, Richard, from me?
A little bit at the moment, yeah.
Sorry, just a second.
Don't go away, guys. Jeremy will be back in a sec. Yeah, here he is.
Sorry about that. So yes, what's the culture of our firm? Certainly, we would say we are a progressive firm. We support our people. We promote our people at an early stage. We recognize and reward very early on good quality work through promotion, etc. So certainly that is probably, it's not very I haven't said that very well, but it's certainly that's what I would describe our culture as, and a very much a collaborative environment as well.
Keith, as an expert in the sort of, let's use the B word, the brand, and what we've just heard from Jeremy, and how do you link the brand and the culture together in your mind?
Critical, one and the same. It drives me mad when I hear about external brand and internal brand. They're the same, particularly in a service organization. They must be the same. Your people are your brand. I think it's really important. We get into vague conversations or airy-fairy flim-flam conversations about values, and actually they're very, very important. They should be. I've never found a better word. I don't like this one, but operationalized. So I think if you say we have a core value of integrity. Actually, can I give you one example from my own experience a couple of years, more than a couple of years back, with a building society who wanted a long conversation, lots of work going into, wanted to have a core value of honesty. And someone in the board meeting said, do we mean proactive or reactive honesty? And that set the whole thing flying. And what you meant was, if someone asks us if we've got the right savings account with them, we have to answer them honestly. That's reactive honesty. But if we know that someone's got the wrong account with us, we should go and tell them that. And that would mean proactive honesty. And that would drive all of their commercial decisions. It would drive all their bet. And what they came down to is a recognition that they couldn't be proactively honest because they needed people to be on the wrong savings account. So they wouldn't commit to that. It's a very long story to cut it very short, but a real commitment to that. I think you have to say, what is it we need to be great at as a business? What do we stand for? What are the values that underpin that? And let's make sure that we work them into simple, which means that and which doesn't mean sort of examples. So the questions around accountability, we have to have examples of it. When BP went pop in a few years back, and what's his name? Tony Hayward was his name, wanted his life back when 12 people had already been killed. BP allegedly had a core value of responsibility. That was in poor supply, the way they handled that whole issue. So I think you have to go, that was an extreme example, but I think you have to take hold of these things that you call values and really operationalize them, drive them into everything you stand for and all the measures and processes that you have. So it should be visible and have no inconsistency, no bad examples being allowed to exist as a kind of, oh, he's just a maverick or she's always one for that. I think you have to drive it into it. And that you can't have your brand without one of our words, integrity. You have to have absolute authenticity in it.
Fantastic. For once, rather than me asking the question, I'm going to ask David to ask the question. And I think you wanted to ask a question to Keith, if I recall, David.
Thanks, Richard. And yeah, Keith, I was just looking at the values that you've aligned, and I was just curious to see where does B Corp fit into the consideration for professional services firms? I think I'm right in saying that there are now 3 professional services firms that have achieved that status.
Yeah, I think it's. I went to a session in London on Wednesday morning, a breakfast briefing by a research company on the investor angle for ESG. Just sort of gets into that sort of angle. And it was a really interesting debate. And one person said, we need to make sure, do we want to do good or feel good? And there was a lot of conversation around greenwashing and bandwagon jumping. And, within that session, I actually heard of a law firm whose declared purpose is to build the new generation of law firm. Now, I don't think on any level of understanding or definition of purpose does that qualify. So if I take it back sort of where I think it's a matter again of authenticity and of understanding that this is something that we need to be good at now. And I think that if we're prepared to stand for this, and I said in my 5 minutes or 5.5 minutes, whatever it was, I don't think anyone can have a purpose unless they have awareness or generosity. And I would put that into sort of as a way towards probably not answering your question directly, but I think it's a matter of saying we absolutely believe in this and do commit to this and are prepared to put our processes up to scrutiny and to make judgments, to make decisions. If strategy is ultimately about decisions we make and choices we make, then we have actually to, if we believe in this, we have to do it all the way through. I think greenwashing is a bit of a curse and it's not doing anybody any favors. Did that answer your question?
Yes, that's
one. Yeah, thanks.
Yeah, and what's interesting, of course, I think is that, again, people, a lot of investors I know are now getting a lot of mandates to invest in companies. And of course, the ability to determine whether that is indeed a valid investment or not based on ESG. I know the EU is trying to come up with a whole bunch of definitions, including gas as nuclear as being green, which has caused a few ripples in certain places. I think there's quite an interesting measurement dimension there. We went back right at the beginning. Are you measuring things differently? And one thing that auditors are very good at is measurement, attest, if you sometimes called. So to what extent do you think the audit profession will be branching out in a new direction? This is a question is really going to Jeremy as the leader of an accountancy firm. And it may, I'm not necessarily talking about your own firm here, Jeremy, but to what extent do you think your profession, well, I'm an accountant, so maybe our profession, sees this as an opportunity to actually come in and help investors and fund managers ensure that their investments are in line with the mandate they've been given by the people who provide the money?
Yeah, very much so. Certainly, there's a lot of talk of it in the accountancy profession at the moment, and I was at a meeting with a group of managing partners on Monday of mid to smaller firms and regional firms as well, and there's there is a perception that there is a real opportunity there to develop another service line for clients in terms of measuring and helping them with that whole ESG aspect. I have to say, it's not something that as a firm, Hayes Macintyre, are particularly focused on at the moment. Our investment is certainly going to be in other sort of core mainstream areas, rather than developing a new service line. But certainly, I think there is a big opportunity for the profession there.
On which happy note, as I think we've also been talking about the opportunities for law firms and ESG as well on previous shows. Yeah. So I'm sure that's a topic that will come back again. Unfortunately, time has ticked. It's funny when you're enjoying yourself how long things take. So I would like to thank David for his insights on what's going on through the minds of investors and in particular acquiring firms. Keith for a wealth of knowledge about a word that many of us use almost, but without thinking, brand, but then unwrapping it. And I think your insight that actually purpose, you need to go down beyond purpose into awareness and generosity is one that I think a lot of people will possibly not have thought about, because people sleep there. And thank you for Jeremy. I'm sorry, but threw you a bit of a tough question there in the middle. It wasn't intended to be too onerous, but thank you both, and thank you all. And we'll be back in 2 weeks' time on the 11th of March with another show, episode 69, and look forward to hopefully seeing you all then. In the meantime, bye for now, and have a great weekend when you get there. Bye.
Thanks all.